Despite what was just said in a question and comment by a friend in the NDP, this is not about a motion that might exist in the future. When we're having a debate in Parliament today, it's on the motion on the order paper, not some slippery slope hypothetical that they would prefer to debate. What we're debating here clearly is two central things, that as parliamentarians, we're not crafting new law, but we're debating an important subject for the nation. And the motion brought forward by the Conservative opposition today is in relation to the State of Israel, an ally and friend, and it has two central elements. First is our traditional historic ties of friendship and alliance with the State of Israel from its early days, and I will explore some of that in my speech here today, Mr. Speaker. But the pith of this motion, the critical part of it, which was carefully missed by my friend from Victoria, and I have utmost respect for the MP from Victoria. He's a smart gentleman. We practiced at the same law firm for a time. But he wanted to debate a motion that didn't exist, as if this was barring speech. This is not about barring speech, Mr. Speaker, but this is about the responsibilities parliamentarians have to condemn actions that are really cover for hate speech, Mr. Speaker. And that is what this motion intends to do. The words are not banning or eliminating free speech. If the honourable member from Victoria and his colleagues looked at the motion, they would see the language is we would reject and condemn the boycott, divestiture and sanction movement, which in many ways, Mr. Speaker, has been a very clever front for anti-Semitic propaganda around the world, Mr. Speaker. And it's sad that some organizations, some groups in Canada, even some labour movement leaders and folks have supported what is really the thin edge of the wedge of hate. If there's a slippery slope at all here, Mr. Speaker, it's not the slippery slope of this motion. It's the slippery slope that tolerating this type of conduct of the boycott movement and words like apartheid Israel and things like that, that is the slippery slope allowing people to mask their anti-Semitism in some sort of boycott language as if this is a business transaction, Mr. Speaker. This, in many ways, this movement has been an attempt for people opposed to the very presence and existence of the State of Israel to promote intolerance, to promote the economic disruption of a country that happens to be the only true democracy in a region of the world that desperately needs more democracy, more freedom, and more respect for the rule of law and rights. So this movement, as parliamentarians, we have the ability, hopefully all whips allow each MP to not just state their views, but on the motion itself, stand and say whether they do condemn this type of conduct, which is the thin edge of the wedge of hate, Mr. Speaker. And there's no other way to describe it. It's discrimination and intolerance dressed up as trade sanctions and economic language. In many ways, like some groups in the United States for years would try and legitimize a front for groups like the Ku Klux Klan and others, and have people run for office, clothed in the appearance of debate, when it was really the advancement of a message that singled out a group of people for hatred, for discrimination. And we should be, as parliamentarians, Mr. Speaker, on all sides of this House, and I'm glad the member from Mount Royal and others have called this for what it is. As parliamentarians, it's our duty to say whether we do condemn this type of dressing up of anti-Semitism. I know myself and many of my colleagues on this side, Mr. Speaker, and clearly many on the other side, see this for what it is, that it is the thin edge of the wedge of discrimination, Mr. Speaker. And this is the balance. This is not, as I said, about banning speech. But our courts and our society have looked at this issue of free speech in the years since the Charter. And Section 1 of the Charter is the attempt for our society and our courts to balance off that fundamental freedom of freedom of speech, which is critical, with hate. And where is the appropriate balance, Mr. Speaker? And courts and jurists have looked at this and tried to try and strike the right balance. And that's when it comes to speech, and that when it comes to incarceration, as my friend from Mount Royal talked about. So the courts have looked at this responsibly to say we need a society that promotes the freedom of expression, even expression that turns the stomachs of others, provided it does not promote hatred directly against an identifiable group, Mr. Speaker. So that's free speech. Our motion today is about condemning a movement that is dressing up hate speech, Mr. Speaker. We're not banning it, but we're calling it for what it is. And I think that's what parliamentarians have a duty to do for their constituents and for the free, diverse society we have. I remember in this place the Aga Khan talking about how cosmopolitan Canada truly is as a beacon to the world because of our diversity and because people come here to embrace the freedoms and reject the conflicts and hate of other places in the world, Mr. Speaker. And as parliamentarians, it's our duty to ensure we do condemn, we do reject, we do point out movements that we think are disruptive to our cohesiveness as a diverse society. And the Keegsters case that the Supreme Court looked at 2 decades ago did look at this specific issue, Mr. Speaker. And you know what the issue was? It was once again anti-Semitism, which is sadly something we can't stamp out in our society. And this was a school teacher willfully promoting hatred, conspiracy theories, ridiculous notions that were really promoting hatred towards the Jewish people, Mr. Speaker. And the Supreme Court balanced that fundamental expression issue 2 decades ago. So clearly we can balance the fact that parliamentarians can condemn and call conduct for what it is. I said the motion has 2 things, and the boycott, divestiture and sanction movement, Mr. Speaker, I think many people in this House have said today, is discrimination and anti-Semitism by other means. And it's a way that people are infiltrating the willingness to single out a group of people and promote hatred, whether it's on campuses, whether it's in groups, whether it's through organizations. And we should call this for what it is, Mr. Speaker. The other part of the motion here today started off with our historic relationship with the State of Israel, Mr. Speaker. And it's a very long and proud relationship that I think bears notice in this debate because, Mr. Speaker, Canada was one of only 33 countries in the United Nations in 1947 that supported the creation of the state, what became the State of Israel, Mr. Speaker. We should be proud of that fact, that we stood for friends and for people, particularly after the horrors of the Holocaust, Mr. Speaker. Lester Pearson, I found myself, this is the second time I'm talking about Lester Pearson in debate this week, Mr. Speaker. You know, my friends will be questioning my conservative bona fides very soon. But, you know, Lester Pearson came up in the withdrawal of the ISIS mission. Pearson would not have supported the move of this current Liberal government. But Lester Pearson was the UN Special Committee chair that looked at issues related to the borders of the State of Israel. And he was awarded the Medal of Valor and the Herzl Award, Mr. Speaker, for that role. And that is good, because we remember the shameful slogan that came from the time when Mackenzie King was Prime Minister. Sadly, it sometimes said it was King. It was not Mr. King, but it was someone in his party that said one is too many, Mr. Speaker, about accepting Jews into Canada fleeing persecution and ultimate death in Europe. And we should be proud that we are condemning such a viewpoint and such exclusion and such discrimination today with this debate in the House. And I was very proud, Mr. Speaker, of the strong stance the last government took with respect to our friend and ally in Israel. As an ally, you don't flee your allies when international opinion and discrimination is swarming around them. You work with them. And we trade with Israel. We share values with Israel. we protect areas of the world with Israel. We have to remember that friends and allies need to see Canada taking a leadership position, and that's why we're here today, not to ban speech, but to condemn veiled attempts at anti-Semitism. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let me repeat a question I had asked one of the members' colleagues, and that is in regards to the whole BDS issue where the movement has really singled out the country of Israel. And that in itself has really raised the whole issue in terms of a racial profile of a country in which Canadians from coast to coast to coast are very much concerned about. And I think maybe it's something in which we could be and should be, like the member from Mount Royal, justifiably so, emphasized a great deal on that particular point, how the BDS is in fact a focus on one country. And I'm wondering if he might want to provide some comments on that particular issue.
Member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank the Parliamentary Secretary for that question. And he referenced the comments today in debate by his colleague from Mount Royal. This is a singling out of one state and by impact one people, which is really what is the veiled attempt here, Mr. Speaker. The irony of the BDS movement, the real irony is the ultimate economic impact, if there is some. Fortunately, people see this for what it is, and it's not as successful as some of these groups might like. But the ultimate people that could be hurt by such an economically skewed approach to attacking the State of Israel are Palestinians that work in some of the plants and facilities of these international companies that trade products around the world, including here in Canada, Mr. Speaker. We've heard the story of SodaStream and others that employ people of all faiths in Israel. And that's what's exciting about the State of Israel, is it's a democracy and it has rights for all, Mr. Speaker. And what I think we see with this movement is an attempt to single out a state, hurt a state, but really what is behind that is singling out a religious faith in a group of people, and that's what should be condemned.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I do thank the sponsor of this motion, and I appreciate that one of the essences of the debate that has arisen today is it allows us to focus on the issue of racism. And I think that's something that every member in this House from all parties, of course, deplores. And one of the essences, though, of racism is stereotyping. It's whenever we adopt a position that attempts to brand a group of people with a certain conclusion without any regard for the individuality or the individual expression within that group, that is an essence of racism. And I'm troubled by an element of that that's present in this motion when it says that the House reject the boycott, divestment, and sanctions BDS movement, which promotes the demonization and delegitimization of the State of Israel. Now, we attempt to say that every proponent, every Canadian who might have a position on BDS and Israel is automatically, we brand and stereotype as someone who is advocating the delegitimization, demonization of Israel. I happen to know for a fact that that is not the case, that there are people who hold the belief, not one that I share, because I'm not a proponent of the BDS movement, but that there could be a person in good faith who thinks that advocating economic sanctions against the government of Israel as a means of pressuring it to take different foreign policy decisions, particularly in the occupied territories, may be a legitimate political action. It may not be that they're trying to demonize or delegitimize Israel. They're trying to pressure it. I
appreciate the Honourable Member. We are running out of time. We've got 5 minutes. The Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks to my friend from Vancouver Kingsway for his comments and talking about racism. And I think, Canada has to learn from our past. As an Irish Canadian, the first group probably discriminated against were the Irish. No Irish need apply. And then Ukrainians, Japanese, Italians, Sikhs, we've seen discrimination, Mr. Speaker. And that's something we should all condemn, which is sort of the language of this motion. But with the BDS movement, what we see is groups that really want to promote hate, dressing it up, as I said, as the BDS movement. We see similar efforts to tarnish the Gay Pride Parade in Toronto by entering a float related to attacking the State of Israel that has nothing to do with celebrating diversity, which is what that parade is about. But these are groups that are trying to use legitimate organizations or covers to really promote their underlying objective, which is anti-Semitism, which is a rejection of the right of the State of Israel to exist. And we should call these things for what they are, Mr. Speaker. We have a tolerant and open society. People can have opinions on a whole range of things. That's encouraged. But when it's actually creeping into hate and discrimination, Mr. Speaker, we don't go so far in this motion to do anything like banning it, as some of them suggest in the NDP, but it is a responsibility of parliamentarians to condemn a conduct that is really fueled at anti-Semitism and rejection of our ally.